The night the palace detonated its own tradition was the night the silence got loud. On February 22nd, 2026, without fanfare, without balcony waves, without a single jewel flashing under chandelier light, Buckingham Palace dropped a statement so clinical it almost disguised the earthquake underneath it. And in doing so, it rewrote the emotional map of the House of Windsor. The announcement confirmed that a sealed private arrangement had carved out a living, breathing piece of Balmoral and handed it not to the reigning king, not to the queen consort, not to any high-ranking heir, but to Lady Louise Windsor, a 22-year-old. No throne claim, no hunger for spotlight, just a name, a trust, and 187 acres of spiritual firepower. The land would now be known as Little Balmoral Manor, and just like that, a centuries-old fortress of royal predictability cracked open. Let's slow this down because the details are not decorative, they are detonators. This wasn't a casual transfer. It wasn't a sentimental afterthought scribbled in the margin of a will. It was codified, sealed, and locked into place years earlier through a private Highland trusteeship structure with sovereign-level authority. That means while the world believed Balmoral was a monolithic symbol under one steady crown, a partition had already been drawn in ink that could not be erased. A joint will, a codicil, a condition so specific it reads like a moral riddle. The recipient must demonstrate quiet service, personal character, and hold no claim to throne or title beyond birth. Read that again. No claim, no ambition, no appetite for elevation. In a family defined by rank, the most powerful gift went to the one who wasn't reaching for more. And what exactly did she inherit? Not just rolling heather and a pretty view. Little Balmoral Manor lies 4 kilometers southwest of the main castle, near a white crag hillock known locally as Ban, wrapped in forested glen, wild moorland, and lochside gardens. It includes a restored Edwardian hunting lodge with oak-paneled reading rooms, archival cabins hidden behind, rhododendrons, a granite chapel used only by the Queen herself, and a 1920s greenhouse once tended by the Queen Mother. Estimated material value, $24 million. Archival value, incapable of calculation. But insiders didn't whisper about pounds. They whispered about breath. Prince Philip once described it as the one place she truly breathes. This wasn't land for display, it was oxygen. So why does that matter? Because oxygen is survival. And whoever controls the place a monarch goes to breathe controls memory. Here's where the pattern sharpens. While this spiritual keystone sat quietly waiting for its named guardian, another plan was unfolding, structured, polished, strategic. In November 2020, Queen Camilla's charitable foundation submitted a proposal for a Scottish writer's retreat mapped suspiciously close to the West Enclosure. Artist renderings, garden refurbishments, budget estimates backed by private donors with Parker Bowles ties. It looked philanthropic. It sounded cultural, but insiders admitted it was about symbolic territory. Scotland, historically cooler toward Camilla, was the one emotional frontier she had not conquered. And Little Balmoral was the anchor point. One internal memo reportedly referenced public aesthetic legacy gaps north of Hadrian's Wall. Translation? A branding problem, a symbolism problem, a territory problem. Camilla believed, perhaps understandably, that after Elizabeth's death, the board would reset, that legacy spaces would be redistributed, that she could architect her own cultural footprint over Scottish soil. What she did not know, what no commentator knew, was that the deed had already been sealed in 2017, following Prince Philip's retirement. The game had ended before she finished setting up her pieces, and then the whispers began in Aberdeen. A young woman in tweeds and a blue scarf arriving quietly on Thursdays. No press, no spectacle, always with a female security officer, riding horses at dawn, walking the perimeter at dusk, visiting the granite chapel without ceremony. For 8 months, she studied handwritten documents under the mentorship of former royal archivists, rehearsing stewardship, not showmanship. She wasn't handed keys, a palace source said. She earned them by proving she would guard the door, not turn it into a gallery. Let's pause on that line. Guard the door, not host exhibitions. Because exhibitions were already being drafted elsewhere. When the palace statement finally dropped, it was sterile, efficient, final. No tiaras, no ceremony, just a land registry update and a courier to Lady Louise's family home. The language ended with a phrase about quiet guardianship. But behind that wording was a thunderclap. A multi-year strategy evaporated in a single paragraph. Inside Clarence House, Queen Camilla reportedly received the notice just hours before it went public. Speechless for a minute, then dismissed the room, walked to the fireplace, whispered she bypassed all of us. Not rage, not hysteria, just calculation meeting finality. Because this wasn't about land. It was about narrative control, about who carries Elizabeth's flame forward. A last-ditch legal clarification request was reportedly sent to the Privy Purse unit, framed carefully as a procedural review, denied within 12 hours. The response, attributed to Princess Anne and her capacity overseeing private estate affairs, was cold steel. Her late Majesty's instructions are sovereign in nature. No review shall be granted. Let the legacy stand. That's not administration. celebration. That's closure. And now the architecture behind Louise's inheritance reveals itself. Anne securing payroll under the Royal Heritage Trust to detach the estate from crown reabsorption. Document transfers completed before interference could begin. Sophie shielding her daughter from rising visibility, declining. Interviews, blocking a BBC mini-documentary. Drone flyovers traced back to consulting firms linked to Parker Bowles donors. Signal jamming fencing installed. And Prince Edward reportedly telling Camilla, "My daughter will not be a placeholder for your ambitions." This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Quiet, deliberate choreography years in the making. And beyond the palace walls, the public reaction detonated faster than anyone predicted. Hashtags surged. Commentators described Louise as the Queen's quietest heir. Authenticity, humility, restraint. Words rarely trending in royal discourse suddenly dominated timelines. Princess Catherine posted a handwritten message about legacy being preserved, not received. 2 million likes in hours. Interpret that however you like, but the symbolism was nuclear. Then came the countermove. Camilla announced a multimedia exhibition titled The Crown's Compassion at St. George's Hall. Timing? Just 29 minutes after confirmation of Louise and Anne's archival project, The Quiet Years. One historian called it a scrapbook of proximity. Ticket sales were suspended days later. The palace homepage replaced it with promotion for The Quiet Years and a quote from Elizabeth about dignity, enduring longer than applause. Silence can be louder than scandal. And in this case, silence chose its guardian. On March 5th, in the Long Gallery at Windsor, an exchange reportedly unfolded between Camilla and Anne. Part confrontation, part confession. Anne's response when challenged? "If the spotlight finds her, Camilla, it's because the public sees what you're trying to hide." 6 words earlier at a naval dinner had already hinted at it. Some stories write themselves, don't they? And here's the uncomfortable question vibrating under all of this. Did Elizabeth foresee the storm? Did she deliberately anchor her spiritual sanctuary not to ambition, not to performance, but to restraint? The chapel at Little Balmoral carries the unofficial motto "Service, not spectacle." The same phrase reportedly etched into a brooch gifted to Louise before the Queen's final visit. A sign, a thread, a transfer of moral gravity. Because what Louise inherited wasn't acreage. It was the Queen's reset button, the place she escaped crowns to remember duty. And now that reset button belongs to someone who refuses to treat it as a throne extension. The monarchy didn't just shift property lines. It shifted symbolic gravity, from performance to preservation, from exhibition to echo. And the silence since then? It isn't empty. It's waiting. By the time the frost settled over the Highland heather, the battle was no longer about acreage. It was about identity, about who carries the invisible weight of a woman who ruled for 70 years without ever flinching in public. And as Little Balmoral Manor stood silent against the granite hills, something extraordinary was happening. The monarchy's center of emotional gravity was shifting, away from spectacle towards something older, quieter, almost sacred. Polling numbers began to surface like aftershocks. A BBC-commissioned survey revealed that 71% of British respondents believed Lady Louise should be offered a formal title if she chose to step into duties, and 64% said they would trust her to represent the family at heritage events over any other young royal. In Scotland, support soared to 84%. 84. In a territory historically protective of Balmoral as Elizabeth's emotional homeland. That number was not just approval, it was endorsement of symbolism. From Glasgow to Inverness, murals appeared, Louise walking through pine forests carrying archival boxes instead of bouquets, dressed in field jackets instead of tiaras. She was being redrawn not as princess in waiting, but as custodian of memory. In Canada, veterans drew parallels between her restraint and Elizabeth's wartime broadcasts of 1940. In New Zealand, a literary foundation praised the joint archival initiative between Louise and Princess Anne. Even Australian editorials, often Republican in tone, acknowledged something different. Monarchy as memory, protected in silence and service. The institution had underestimated a hunger, not for glitter, not for reinvention, but for continuity that feels authentic. And then came the envelope, delivered quietly to Little Balmoral by a royal courier, sealed in King Charles III's unmistakable hand. Inside, a letter addressed simply, "My niece, the keeper of her flame." The phrase alone sent palace corridors into speculation. According to aides, Charles wrote, "Your grandmother believed that greatness grows in silence. I now see she was speaking of you." And attached to those words was an offer, full elevation to Her Royal Highness Princess Louise, with a formal portfolio in youth education, historical preservation, and cultural reconciliation across the Commonwealth. On paper, it looked like unity, a monarch recognizing symbolic momentum and aligning it with institutional structure. But the conditions told a different story. Relocation to St. James's Palace, armed protection, suspension of private equestrian coaching, withdrawal from public academic pursuits. In other words, protection through containment, honor through visibility, elevation through surrender of independence. And this is where the story fractures into something unforgettable. Because instead of stepping forward into the glow of a new title, Lady Louise stepped outward, onto the stone steps of Little Balmoral itself. No grand ballroom, no palace press corps, just a thin veil of snow across the Lochside Hills and a handful of local officials, historians, and educators. What was meant to be a modest heritage dedication became the quietest defiance the monarchy has witnessed in decades. "The place I inherited is not a stage," she began, breath visible in the Highland air. "It is a stewardship." And then the line that froze every headline writer in Britain: "I believe duty does not require a title. Not today. Not for me. And not for what this house stands to protect." No applause. Only silence. Not awkward silence. Not confusion. Reverence. In that moment, she declined elevation without rejecting loyalty. She refused spotlight without challenging the crown. She chose the harder path: influence without rank, symbol without ornament. And then she unveiled something far more strategic than a title: the Grey House Initiative, a living trust, an educational program dedicated to preserving unseen royal archives, supporting youth leadership rooted in historical responsibility, and funding fellowships for women in ethical governance and public service, structured with full legal independence from the Crown Estate and the Duchy of Lancaster, administered by a civilian board. Princess Anne serving as honorary co-chair. That detail matters. Civilian governance. No ceremonial leash. No palace micromanagement. The sanctuary remained sovereign in spirit. "This is not a museum," Louise emphasized. "It is a promise." Within 48 hours, a quiet university livestream had drawn over 9 million views. A single trending comment captured the mood. She didn't become a princess. She became the monarch of memory. And just as the public awe reached fever pitch, another voice entered the arena. Meghan Markle, appearing on a U.S. talk show, delivered a line that ignited digital wildfire. "When people are elevated based on silence rather than service, we have to ask, what values are we rewarding?" No names mentioned. No direct accusations. But the interpretation was instant. Social feeds split. Commentators condemned the remark as divisive. Headlines accused her of missing the emotional temperature of the moment. And then came the counterstatement, not from Buckingham Palace, not from a spin room, but from Princess Anne and Prince Edward in a rare joint declaration. Lady Louise Windsor has never asked for a throne, nor a stage. She has only ever accepted responsibility when others discarded it. Responsibility when others discarded it. Read between those words. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's exhibition, The Crown's Compassion, was formally closed, citing internal review. No new projects announced, no rebranding, silence. Buckingham Palace quietly updated its official family page. No new styling, no dramatic font, just a dedicated subsection: Lady Louise Windsor, keeper of Little Balmoral. Beneath it, a quote attributed to Queen Elizabeth II: "It is not the crown that grants duty. It is duty that gives meaning to the crown." That quote was not random. It was surgical. Privately, insiders say King Charles was moved to tears by Louise's refusal. His handwritten reply reportedly contained only 2 sentences: "You have chosen the harder path, but the truer one. Your grandmother would have smiled." And for the first time since Elizabeth's death, he referred to Louise not as niece, but as her echo. Echo. Not successor. Not rival. Echo. Within palace corridors, historians have begun calling this moment a shift in moral architecture. Because for the first time in decades, symbolic power did not climb upward toward the throne. It folded inward, towards something more elemental. Palace staff now refer to Little Balmoral as a keystone holding, a phrase once reserved for Windsor Castle itself. Younger royals have reportedly expressed interest in contributing to the archive initiative under Louise's mentorship. The quiet guardian is no longer invisible. She is magnetic precisely because she refuses magnetism. And that may be the most destabilizing element of all. And because when influence flows without title, it cannot be easily contained. When authenticity outpaces performance, the public recalibrates its loyalty. And when the spiritual heart of Balmoral, described by Elizabeth herself as her reset, her breathing place, rests in the hands of someone uninterested in turning it into a stage, the monarchy faces a paradox. Its most compelling figure is the one who refuses elevation. So what happens next? Does the institution eventually formalize what the public already feels? Does symbolic gravity continue drifting toward Little Balmoral? Or does silence once again become the sharpest instrument in royal strategy? Snow still falls over the granite chapel. The oak-paneled reading rooms remain lit by firelight. The archives are being cataloged page by page without press releases, without ribbon cuttings. And somewhere inside that restored Edwardian lodge, the woman entrusted with the Queen's quietest sanctuary continues her work, guarding not just land, but legacy. No